I want to tell you something that took me 4 years to understand. The most dangerous lie in a marriage is not the one your spouse tells you. It is the one you tell yourself, every morning, when you decide that the quiet is normal and the distance is temporary and the person sleeping beside you is simply tired, or stressed, or going through something they will eventually share with you when they are ready. I told myself that lie for a very long time. My name is Daniel Hargrove. I am 53 years old. I spent 22 years as a structural engineer, the kind of work that requires you to trust mathematics absolutely, to believe that if the calculations are correct the thing will hold, that precision is its own guarantee. I retired early, 2 years ago, after a contract buyout that left me with enough financial security to choose my days. I live now, or lived, until recently, in a house on the edge of a small town in Vermont, on 3 acres that include a pond and a stand of white birch trees that are extraordinarily beautiful in October and require no management whatsoever, which is one of the reasons I bought the property. The house was chosen together. Everything in our life was chosen together, or so I believed. My wife's name is Claire. She is 50 years old. She was a landscape architect for 17 years, and then, 6 years ago, she pivoted. That was the word she used, pivoted, with the confidence of someone who had thought it through and was announcing a decision rather than requesting a discussion, into running a small but respected interior design consultancy from an office she maintained in town. The consultancy was called Meridian. It had 3 employees, a good reputation among the kind of clients who pay carefully for the particular reassurance of good taste, and it required, Claire explained, a degree of social and professional flexibility that the regular hours of her previous career had not demanded. The flexibility, I would come to understand, extended further than I knew. We have been married for 26 years. We have one son, Marcus, who is 24 and works as a sound engineer in Nashville and who calls on weekends and speaks about music with a specificity and passion that I find genuinely interesting, even though I know very little about it. Marcus is a perceptive young man. He noticed things, during visits home, that he mentioned to me carefully, never alarming, never accusatory, but with the particular precision of someone who loves 2 people and is watching something he can't quite name. The marriage, from the outside, would have looked comfortable. We were known, in our social circle, as a stable couple, the word stable appearing often enough in how people described us that I should, perhaps, have examined what it was actually measuring. We went to dinners. We maintained friendships. We traveled occasionally, to the kind of places that photograph well and that you describe to people afterward with a competent enthusiasm. We did not fight, largely because Claire had always been allergic to conflict. She had a way of removing herself from tension so smoothly that arguments never quite reached the confrontation that might have cleared them. She requested closeness once a month. I want you to understand what I mean by this, because it sounds clinical when I say it plainly, and the reality of it was not clinical, it was the slow erosion of something I had once taken for granted and come to quietly grieve. Once a month, with a kind of affectionate but unmistakably scheduled energy, Claire would be warm in the way she had been in our earlier years, attentive, close, interested in me. And then the warmth would recede, as reliably as a tide, and we would return to the arrangement of 2 people who lived in the same house with care and courtesy but without the particular, irreplaceable closeness that I had, for a long time, mistaken for something that was simply changing form rather than disappearing. The distance had been there so long I had stopped calling it distance. I called it our rhythm. I stopped calling it our rhythm the night I found the photographs. Daniel's opening establishes a pattern that psychologists recognize as one of the most corrosive dynamics in long-term relationships, the normalization of emotional deprivation. By framing the marriage's emotional retreat as a rhythm rather than a warning, Daniel demonstrates the cognitive adaptation that sustained companionship demands, the mind's tendency to reclassify pain as personality, absence as temperament, and the fading of intimacy as the natural evolution of mature love. His professional background as a structural engineer is not incidental. A man trained to trust calculations, to believe that correct inputs guarantee stable outcomes, is particularly vulnerable to the illusion that a marriage sustained with care and courtesy is therefore sound. He has been measuring the structure by the wrong instruments, checking that the walls are standing without examining what they are made of. The detail of closeness once a month, offered with scheduled precision, is the story's central psychological wound. It describes not the end of affection but something more complicated, affection rationed, managed, distributed with a control that suggests Claire is not absent of feeling but is actively regulating its expression. Whether this regulation is driven by guilt, emotional compartmentalization, or a more deliberate management of two parallel emotional lives will become clearer as the story develops. What is clear from the outset is that Daniel has absorbed this rationing as his reality, and that the genuine danger in such arrangements is not the pain they produce but the extraordinary patience they require, which can make a man wait far too long for a tide that is not, in fact, coming back. The ordinary life of a marriage in its 24th or 25th year has a texture that is difficult to convey to someone who has not lived inside one. It is not unhappy, most of the time. That is the important and easily misunderstood thing. The unhappiness, when it exists, is not the acute, identifiable unhappiness of conflict or crisis, it is something quieter, more ambient, the way a house can smell slightly damp without any visible evidence of water, a smell that you stop noticing because you are always inside it. We had our routines. Claire left for the Meridian office by 8:30 most mornings, dressed in a considered, understated way she dressed for client-facing days, particular colors, particular scarves, the kind of assembled appearance that communicates competence and calm simultaneously. I would remain home and manage the things that the retirement of an organized person tends to produce, the maintenance of the house and property, projects I had promised myself in the working years and now had time to execute, reading, occasional consulting work that came through my professional network and which I accepted when it interested me. We had dinner together most evenings. This was consistent, and I valued it, the table, the food, the conversation that moved through the ordinary territories of daily life, what had happened at the office, what Marcus had said on the weekend call, what needed attention in the house, what we were reading. It was, I thought, the solid, unpretentious rhythm of a lasting partnership. Two people who had built enough together to be comfortable with each other's silences. What I began to notice, in the year before everything changed, was a shift in the quality of the silences. There is a silence that is the product of shared comfort, the silence between people who have nothing pressing to say because the underlying understanding is complete. And there is a different silence, the silence of two people each maintaining their own separate interior life with the mutual, unspoken agreement not to examine too closely what the other is holding. I had assumed, for years, that our silences were the first kind. The year I am describing was the year I began to feel, in a way I could not immediately articulate, that they might be the second. Claire had always been a person of measured personal disclosure. She did not talk through her feelings in the way I did, where I tended to process externally, she processed internally and presented conclusions. This had always been a point of minor friction between us, easily enough smoothed. But in the year I'm describing, the conclusions she presented had become increasingly sparse. When I asked about her day, I received accurate but abbreviated accounts. The meeting went well, the client liked the proposal, traffic was difficult on the way home. The texture of what had filled her hours was absent. She had also begun to spend more time at the office. The expansion was gradual, a Thursday evening here, a Saturday morning there, framed always as client pressure, project deadlines, the particular demands of a consultancy in a competitive market. I believed this, because I had no specific reason not to, and because Claire had always been professional in the way of someone for whom work was a genuine source of identity rather than merely income. The extra hours seemed, in the context of everything else about her, consistent. Marcus visited in early spring, a 4-day visit, which was longer than his usual stays. He is a young man of careful observations, and on his second evening there, after Claire had excused herself to take a phone call and been gone for the better part of 40 minutes, he said to me, quietly, without looking up from the glass he was turning in his hands, "Does she do that a lot? Work calls in the evening?" I said. "Leave the room for them," he said. I said it was busy season. He nodded and let the subject die, and I understood from the particular way he let it die that he was not satisfied with the answer and was choosing, out of love for both of us, not to press it. A month after Marcus's visit, I noticed the second phone. It was not dramatic, the noticing. I was looking for a pen in the kitchen drawer, the specific drawer that Claire used as a catch-all for small necessities, and I found, beneath a fold of spare notepad pages, a phone I did not recognize. Small, dark, without a case. I picked it up. The screen was locked. I put it back where I found it and stood at the kitchen counter for a moment with the particular suspension of a person who has just touched something unexpected and has not yet decided what to do with the information. A second phone. I thought about this for the rest of the afternoon. I constructed explanations with diligence: an old work phone kept for specific purposes, a backup device purchased for travel. The explanations were not impossible. But they did not quite satisfy the specific question of why a phone hidden under notepad pages in a kitchen drawer, rather than in any of the visible, ordinary places where phones are kept. I said nothing about it. I put it away in the drawer of my mind alongside Marcus's question and the extra evenings at the office and the scheduled warmth, and I waited, with the patience of an engineer who knows that structures reveal their weaknesses in time, for the pattern to become visible. The accumulation of small signals in this section traces a classic pattern of relational deterioration that psychologists describe as emotional withdrawal, a progressive retraction of the self from shared space, executed with enough graduality that the partner registers discomfort without being able to identify its source. Claire's management of disclosure, offering accurate but textured absent accounts of her days, the presented conclusions without the underlying process, is the behavior of someone who has learned to partition her internal life. She is not lying, exactly. She is simply omitting the parts that would require explanation. Marcus's question, does she leave the room for them, is the story's first significant external confirmation that Daniel's perception is not projection. A young man visiting for 4 days, without access to the emotional history of the marriage, notices the same thing Daniel has been rationalizing for months, that the physical act of leaving the room for phone calls is a spatial expression of a more fundamental withdrawal. The second phone is where the story's architecture shifts from atmosphere to evidence. A hidden phone is not ambiguous the way extra office hours or abbreviated dinners are ambiguous. It is a deliberate, material preparation for a separate life. It requires purchase, setup, ongoing concealment. It cannot be rationalized as busyness or introversion or the natural rhythmic withdrawal of a long partnership. Daniel's choice not to confront it immediately is the behavior of a man who understands, on some level, that confrontation will end the particular kind of not knowing he still inhabits, and is not yet fully willing to leave it. The second phone changed my relationship to the house. Before I found it, I had moved through our shared space with the unconsidered ease of a man who lives in his own home. After, I moved differently, not furtively, but with a new layer of attention to what the space contained, the way you move through a room after you've noticed an unfamiliar sound in the walls, not afraid exactly, but listening. I began to notice things I had been too comfortable to see. The mileage on Claire's car, which I had occasion to check when I was arranging a service appointment in June, was higher than I would have expected for a person who drove a consistent route between home and an office 14 minutes away. Not dramatically higher, nothing so obvious as to constitute proof of anything, but enough that the mental arithmetic produced a small, unresolved discrepancy. I noted it, filed it, continued. She had a client she mentioned occasionally, a name that appeared in conversation every few weeks, attached to a project she described as demanding and creatively complex. The client's name was Elliot. A residential renovation in the county, she said, with particular requirements that were keeping her more engaged than usual. The name Elliot appeared in conversation with a careful frequency, often enough to establish legitimacy, not so often as to attract scrutiny. I found myself, in retrospect, impressed by the calibration. In July, I made what felt, at the time, like an innocent decision. I began keeping a private record. Not a journal, exactly. I am not by temperament a journal keeper. More a structured log, dates, times, Claire's stated activity versus the observable facts I could attach to those claims. The record keeping was not comfortable. It felt like an act of suspicion, which it was, and I had not previously thought of myself as a suspicious man. But the engineer in me responded to the accumulation of small inconsistencies with a desire to see them organized rather than dispersed, to understand whether they formed a pattern or were simply the background noise of a life I was reading too closely. They formed a pattern. On 3 separate Thursdays in July and August, Claire had told me she was at the office for late client meetings. On each of those evenings, I had, without announcing my intention to anyone, driven past the Meridian office. On the first occasion, her car was in the lot, consistent with her account. On the second, her car was absent, the office dark, the lot empty. On the third, the same, dark, empty, no car. On the second and third occasions, she had returned home at her stated time, full of the plausible detail that occupies the spaces in a fabricated account. The meeting had moved to a client's home, or to a restaurant, which was a reasonable enough thing to happen. I accepted these explanations. But I added them to the log. I also looked more carefully at our finances. This required some care, because I had always been the primary manager of our financial accounts, a division of responsibility that had emerged organically from my professional background and had remained stable throughout the marriage. I began, in August, to review the statements of the accounts I did not habitually examine, Claire's personal account, which I had access to but rarely reviewed out of an unexamined respect for her financial autonomy. What I found was a pattern of cash withdrawals that were individually small but collectively significant, occurring at irregular intervals across the preceding 18 months. The pattern of irregularity was itself a kind of pattern, random enough to resist obvious analysis, consistent enough to suggest purposefulness. What complicated the picture, and what constituted the first genuine red herring I encountered in this period, was a discovery that seemed, briefly, to offer an entirely different explanation. I found, in the same month, evidence of a private savings account in Claire's name. The account held a considerable sum, enough to constitute either a long-term secret saving project or the kind of financial preparation someone makes before a significant life change. My first interpretation was the former, that Claire had been quietly building a financial reserve as a form of personal security, a behavior that would be unusual but not necessarily sinister. This interpretation sustained me for approximately 2 weeks, during which I managed to feel something close to relief. Perhaps the extra hours and the hidden phone and the unexplained mileage were the architecture of financial privacy rather than relational betrayal. The relief did not survive contact with the second phone, which I found again, this time charged and briefly unattended on the kitchen counter while Claire was in the garden, and which I was able to unlock using the face recognition function before she returned. 18 months of messages. A name I did not know. A relationship whose intimacy was unambiguous from the first screen I saw, and which I closed after 30 seconds because I had seen enough and because I understood, with the sudden, cold clarity of a man whose calculations have just confirmed a structural failure, that the thing I had been circling was not going to be anything other than what it was. I put the phone back. I went to the study. I sat in the dark for a long time. The investigative period Daniel describes in this section represents a psychological state that has no fully satisfying name, the liminal space between suspicion and certainty, inhabited by a person who is actively gathering proof while simultaneously postponing the moment of full knowing. His log-keeping is a textbook response from someone with an analytical mind confronting an emotionally unmanageable situation. By converting the experience into data, he creates a buffer between the raw emotional reality and his capacity to function within it. The Elliott misdirection is worth examining carefully. The introduction of a plausible client name, offered with calibrated frequency, is the behavior of someone skilled in narrative management, someone who understands that the most effective cover story is one that is technically true in some dimension. Perhaps Elliott exists as a client, while directing attention away from what it is meant to conceal. The savings account red herring is perhaps the most psychologically revealing moment in this section. Daniel's relief upon discovering it, his rapid construction of a benign explanation for everything, exposes the depth of his desire not to find what he is looking for. A man who wants to discover the truth would not feel relief at an ambiguous alternative explanation, he would feel compelled to eliminate it before moving on. Daniel's 2 weeks of relief are the behavior of a man who loves his wife and is hoping, with the last available hope, that the story has a different ending. The phone, unlocked on the counter, ends that hope, not with a confrontation but with a 30-second encounter with irrefutable text, after which Daniel does the profoundly human thing: he closes the screen, replaces the phone, and sits in the dark. The facts are now known. The response to them has not yet been decided. I hired a private investigator in September. The decision carried a particular moral weight that I did not dismiss. There is something deeply invasive about engaging a professional to surveil your spouse. It feels, at every stage, like a violation of something fundamental about the compact between two people who have chosen each other. I knew this. I made the decision anyway, because I had learned, in 30 years of engineering, that intuition and partial information are not sufficient basis for a conclusion that will require structural confidence to act on. I needed what engineers call full load testing. I needed certainty I hadn't conjured from my own fears. The investigator's name was Paul Ryder, recommended by an attorney colleague I had known professionally for years and trusted absolutely. Ryder was thorough and unintrusive in the way of experienced professionals who understand that their value lies precisely in what they do not reveal about their methods. I gave him a 2-week window. I asked him to document, not to interpret. What he documented was both more and less than I had expected. The man's name was not Elliot. Elliot, it emerged, was a real client, a genuine residential project that Claire had been managing, which explained the legitimacy of the name's appearances in conversation and removed it from the category of constructed fiction. The cover story had been borrowed from reality, which is always more durable than invention. The man's actual name was Stephen Marsh. He was 54. He owned a small commercial real estate firm with offices in Burlington. He was separated, not yet divorced, from his wife of 19 years. He and Claire had been, by Ryder's estimate, in contact for approximately 2 years and engaged in what the photographs documented as a sustained, intimate relationship conducted largely during business hours and the occasional evening when Claire's explained absences from home were extended by the flexibility her professional role provided. The photographs were clear. Ryder is thorough. What they showed was not only the existence of the relationship but, in a detail I had not anticipated, evidence of the dynamics within it. In several of the longer surveillance images, at outdoor restaurants, in parking lots, at the entrance to what appeared to be a small hotel in Burlington, it was possible to read, with the uncomfortable intimacy of the voyeur, something of the emotional register between them. They were comfortable together. The ease between them was not the heated, consuming quality of a new affair but the settled, practiced ease of two people who had been spending extended, unguarded time together. They knew how each other moved. They had, unmistakably, developed habits. This was worse than simple betrayal. Simple betrayal is a crisis. This was a parallel life. During the same period, without coordinating the timing, I had a phone call with Marcus that shifted my understanding of the secondary landscape around this situation. He called on a Sunday, as usual, and we talked for a while about his work, and then he went quiet in the particular way he goes quiet when he is deciding whether to say something. I waited. He has always come to his own conclusions in his own time, and I have always learned to wait for them. "Dad," he said finally, "has anything changed with you and Mom? This summer, I mean." I asked him what had made him think of this. "I called the house phone a few times when I couldn't reach your cell," he said carefully. "And the woman who answered wasn't Mom. She said she was a neighbor, helping with something in the house. I didn't think much of it the first time. The second time I thought it was odd. I did not recognize this account at all. I had no recollection of a woman answering our house phone or of having asked a neighbor for any assistance. I told Marcus I would look into it. I thought about this for several days before I understood it. The most likely explanation, which required an uncomfortable reconstruction of the chronology, was that Claire had, on at least 2 occasions, had someone present at the house during hours when I was reliably absent, and that this someone had answered the phone and invented a cover identity with a quick competence that suggested it was not the first time such a situation had required management. The involvement of the house itself, our house, shifted something in the weight of what I was carrying. I met with an attorney in October. Her name was Sandra Alcott, a family law specialist with a matter-of-fact precision that I found steadying. She walked me through what a separation would involve structurally: assets, the house, timelines. She did not ask me whether I was certain I wanted to proceed. She treated the decision as mine to make in my own time and offered only the information I needed to make it from a position of clarity. I left her office feeling, for the first time in months, that I was on solid ground again. Not happy ground. Not comfortable ground. But ground that would hold. The revelation of Stephen Marsh reconfigures the entire preceding narrative in a significant way. The careful introduction of the name Elliot into domestic conversation, borrowed from a real client, sustainable as a cover precisely because it could withstand surface-level scrutiny, reveals an sophistication in concealment that goes beyond opportunistic deception. Claire has been managing a narrative, not simply hiding a relationship. There is a distinction between these two things that matters psychologically. Narrative management requires sustained, active attention to the details of one's own deception, an ongoing awareness of what has been said to whom and what must be maintained for internal consistency. This level of management suggests not a person swept away by unexpected feeling but a person who made a deliberate and ongoing series of choices. The detail Marcus reveals, an unrecognized woman answering the house phone, is the element that most dramatically escalates the emotional stakes of this section. The other transgressions have occurred in external spaces, hotel rooms, restaurants, parking lots. This one occurred in the shared domestic space of a home Daniel believed was inviolate, a boundary whose crossing represents a qualitatively different order of disrespect. Daniel's response to this, several days of quiet, followed by understanding, is consistent with his established psychological pattern. He processes before he reacts, allows comprehension to arrive fully before acting on it. His meeting with the attorney is not premature rage but the move of a man who has completed his assessment and is now beginning to act with the same structured, load-tested confidence he brought to every structural decision of his professional life. The ground is now visible. The decision, not yet announced, has been made. I chose a Saturday morning, because Saturday mornings in our household had always been unhurried. No office, no fixed appointments, the wide, unscheduled time of people who have reached the stage of life where weekends are genuinely free. I made coffee. I set 2 cups on the kitchen table. I sat down and waited for Claire to come downstairs. She appeared at 8:15, in the loose gray sweater she wore on weekend mornings, her hair not yet arranged, and there was a moment, just a moment, when she looked the way she had looked 20 years ago in this kitchen, and I understood something about grief that I had not understood before, that you can grieve for a person who is standing directly in front of you. She saw the 2 cups and sat down across from me. She looked at my face. Whatever she read there made her very still. I put the envelope on the table. Not writers' photographs, those I kept in reserve. What I placed between us first was simpler. A printed sheet with the name Stephen Marsh and his contact details, drawn from writer's documentation, and below it, the timeline I had assembled from the log I had been keeping since summer. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. "Sit with that for a moment," I said. "And then tell me what you want to say." The silence lasted perhaps 2 minutes. In that silence I heard the refrigerator's low hum, and the sound of wind in the birch trees outside, and the particular quality of stillness that a Saturday morning produces when 2 people are occupying the same space and one of them is deciding how to speak. "How long have you known?" she said. "Known for certain." "Since September," I said. "Suspected longer." "I was going to," she began, and stopped. "Tell me," I said. The question was not unkind, but it was precise, and she felt the precision of it. "I didn't know how," she said. I looked at her for a moment. She is a person of significant intelligence and significant composure, and both were present, but the composure was the fragile, working composure of someone managing something enormous rather than the natural composure of someone who feels at ease. There was a quality in her eyes that I had not seen in a long time, something unguarded, something unmanaged. I did not take satisfaction in it, which surprised me. I had expected, at some point in my imagination of this conversation, to feel something like vindication. I felt only the particular, heavy sorrow of a man who has been right about something he desperately wanted to be wrong about. How long? I asked. 2 years, she said, after a pause. And the second phone. And the cash withdrawals. And the savings account. She closed her eyes briefly. The savings account was, I didn't know what I was going to do. I told myself it was security. For either possibility. You were planning an exit, I said. I was planning for uncertainty, she said. Which is not. Which is not the same thing, I said. But it means you knew, for a significant period, that this was a possible outcome. Which means you were living with us while also preparing to leave. She had no response to this that satisfied either of us. I asked about the house. The woman on the phone. She looked at me when I said this with an expression that contained, I thought, genuine shame, not the defensive variety but the real kind, the kind that doesn't try to explain itself. That was a mistake, she said. A serious one. I know. That was in our house, Claire. I know, she said. I know. We talked for 3 hours. It was not a conversation I will fully describe here, because some of what was said was too personal even for this telling, and because some of what was said was simply the careful, painful work of two people who have been together for 26 years and have found themselves in a room with the full, unmediated weight of what their life has actually been rather than what they believed it to be. What I will say is this: about 90 minutes into the conversation, after the accounting had been done and the facts were on the table and Claire had answered what she could and acknowledged what she could not, she said something that I have thought about many times since. I didn't think you needed me, she said. I know I know how it sounds. But you are so self-contained, Daniel. You always have been. You've never needed anything from me that you couldn't, if necessary, provide for yourself. I sat with this. So the once a month, I said. She looked at me, and I watched the understanding of what I was saying reach her, the recognition that I had noticed the scheduling, had named it, had lived with the specific grief of it for longer than she had imagined. I was managing both, she said quietly. I know that's not an excuse. No, I said. It's not. I told her I would be moving out of the house at the end of the month, into a rental I had already identified. I told her I had spoken with Sandra Alcott. I told her that I intended the process to be orderly and respectful, and that Marcus would be told by both of us together, and that I had no interest in punishing her and every interest in proceeding with the least possible damage. She said, "Are you not angry?" I thought about it honestly. I'm past angry, I said. I was angry in August, when I was still hoping to be wrong. Now I'm just grieving, I think. The way you grieve for something that has been gone for a while and you're only now having the funeral. She looked at me for a long time. I'm sorry, Daniel, she said. The apology was plain and direct and without the elaborate qualification of a person managing their own guilt. It was, I thought, the most genuinely present she had been with me in years. I know, I said. The confrontation in this section achieves what the best confrontations in stories of this kind achieve: it refuses to be a scene of simple villainy and victimhood. Claire does not collapse into theatrical guilt, and Daniel does not erupt into justified rage. Instead, what occurs is something more emotionally complex and more truthful, a reckoning between two people who have both, in different ways and with different degrees of culpability, failed the marriage they shared. Claire's statement, "I didn't think you needed me," is the scene's most significant moment, because it is both a genuine psychological truth and an insufficient justification. She is describing a real perception, Daniel's self-containment, his structural independence, the quality of competent self-sufficiency that engineering and temperament built in him over decades. But she is also, in naming this, revealing her own failure, rather than naming the need she perceived in herself, for feeling necessary, for emotional reciprocity, for being sought rather than simply available. She sought its fulfillment elsewhere. The scheduled closeness now reads differently in this light, not simply the rationing of a person conducting a double life, but the behavior of someone who had long since transferred her genuine emotional investment and was offering Daniel a residual minimum she considered sufficient for maintenance. Daniel's response to the question, "Are you not angry?" is the emotional centerpiece of the confrontation. To locate oneself, at the moment of exposure, not in rage but in grief, the specific grief of a funeral for something whose absence predated the ceremony, is the response of a man who has had months to move through anger and has arrived at something more durable: clarity, sorrow, and the measured decision to proceed with dignity. I moved out on the last Saturday of October, into a rented apartment above a bookshop on the main street of the town, 2 rooms and a kitchen, high ceilings, windows that looked east over a church spire and received the morning light in a way that I found, almost immediately, deeply consoling. I had not thought about morning light in years. Comfort makes you stop noticing the specific gifts of your environment, and loss, whatever else it does, restores the capacity for attention. Marcus came from Nashville 10 days after Claire and I told him together on a video call, the kind of call that goes quiet in the middle in a way that tells you a family is processing rather than responding. He sat in the apartment with me for 3 days. He did not try to adjudicate. He did not ask me for details I had not offered. He made coffee and suggested we walk and talked about his work and asked me, once, whether I was eating properly, with the particular parental concern of a young man who has just understood that his parents need looking after too. On his last evening, he said, "I noticed things when I visited. I didn't say enough." I told him he had said exactly the right amount. "I didn't want to be the one who," he began. "Marcus," I said. "You were not responsible for any of this. You were a son visiting his parents. That's all you needed to be." He nodded and looked out the east-facing window, and we sat for a while in the quiet, and it was not an unhappy quiet. The process with Sandra Alcott proceeded with the efficiency of well-prepared documentation. The house would be sold, we were in agreement on this, because neither of us wanted the specific difficulty of the other continuing to inhabit a shared space alone. The financial settlement was fair. I had the structural advantage of having managed our finances carefully across 26 years, and Claire, to her credit, did not contest the terms. The Meridian consultancy was hers entirely, which was correct. She had built it, she should keep it. I heard, through a mutual friend, that Stephen Marsh and Claire were no longer together. The information arrived about 4 months after I moved out, with the neutral, incidental air of town news. I noted it and did not dwell on it. It was not relevant to my life in any meaningful way. What was relevant was the slower, more personal work of understanding what had actually happened to the marriage, not the legal version of events, which is about assets and timelines, but the human version, which is about the accumulation of small failures and unspoken needs that constitute the real anatomy of a collapse. I thought, often, about what Claire had said, "I didn't think you needed me." I turned this over many times, because I could not fully dismiss it. Not as a justification, it was not a justification, but as a piece of information about how I had been perceived inside the marriage, and whether that perception had any basis in reality. And I had to conclude, in the uncomfortable honesty of a man with no one to defend himself to, in some measure, it did. I am a self-contained person. I had always been more comfortable demonstrating competence than demonstrating need. In the long plateau of a comfortable marriage, I had allowed the expression of need, of longing, of specific, named desire for her rather than simply for the arrangement of our shared life, to atrophy without noticing. This was not what caused her to do what she did. I want to be clear about this, because I spent considerable time ensuring that I did not perform the specific cruelty of assigning myself responsibility for her choices. What she did was chosen, was sustained, was conducted with a degree of premeditation that removes it entirely from the category of things I could have prevented. But I could have contributed to a different marriage. We both could have. The question of who did more damage is not the same as the question of who bears the entirety of the blame. I began, in the winter months in the apartment above the bookshop, to practice something I had not practiced in years, the deliberate expression of what I actually felt and wanted, to myself first and then, gradually, to the people around me. Not in the dramatic mode of someone recovering from crisis, that is its own performance, but in the quieter, more sustainable mode of a man who has decided that self-containment is not the same as strength, and that the habit of managing his inner life in private had cost him, in some measure he could now see but not fully calculate, the kind of intimacy that requires visible need to sustain. I speak with a therapist now, on Tuesday afternoons. His name is Dr. Ellison, which produces a small, private irony every week, and he asks me the kinds of questions that only become available when you have nothing left to protect. We have been talking, in particular, about the architecture of availability, what it means to be present rather than capable, to offer yourself rather than your management of a situation. In April I walked through the house for the last time with the estate agent, doing the standard pre-sale walkthrough. The birch trees were just beginning to leaf out, the first, tentative green of early spring, still light enough to look almost silver in the afternoon. The pond was high from the spring thaw. The hydrangeas I had planted the year we moved in had survived another winter and were already showing the earliest hints of what they would become. I stood at the back window and looked out at all of it for a while. A great deal had been built in this place. Not all of it false, not all of it wasted. 2 people had raised a good son here. Had, for some years, been genuinely happy here, or something close enough to happiness to constitute a real thing. The marriage's failure was not the annihilation of its entirety, it was the ending of something that had been, for a long time before it ended, already changing into something neither of us had managed the honesty to name. I turned away from the window and followed the estate agent through the rest of the rooms. Outside, the birch trees moved in the April wind. Everything that had been waiting underground was beginning, slowly and with absolute patience, to find its way back up. Here is the thing I have learned, in the years since: the opposite of a marriage spent in managed distance is not a marriage of constant emotional intensity. It is something quieter and more demanding than that. It is the daily, imperfect, renewable practice of being visible to the person you love, of allowing yourself to be needed, and to let the specific reality of the other person land on you rather than simply exist beside you as a familiar and unexamined comfort. I did not know how to do this fully, inside the marriage. I am learning, now. Statistics on long-term marital satisfaction consistently find that emotional responsiveness, the felt sense of being heard and mattering to your partner, is a stronger predictor of relationship durability than compatibility, shared interests, or even the absence of conflict. What erodes a marriage, most often, is not catastrophic failure but quiet, unaddressed distance, the slow, mutual decision to stop reaching. I had stopped reaching. So had she. The difference is only in what each of us did next. The resolution Daniel arrives at carries the particular weight of a man who has earned his understanding through suffering rather than arrived at it theoretically. His reflection on Claire's words, "I didn't think you needed me," and his willingness to hold them as partial truth rather than simple deflection is an act of genuine psychological maturity. It would be far more comfortable, and entirely understandable, to receive those words only as excuse-making and dismiss them. That Daniel instead examines them for what they might reveal about his own contribution to the marriage's emotional climate is the growth that the story's entire arc has been moving toward. The detail of the April walk-through, the birch trees leafing in silver green, the hydrangeas surviving another winter, performs an important emotional function. It confirms that what was built here was real. Not false. Not wasted. Simply insufficient, in ways that neither person found the language for until it was too late for the language to help. The statistical ending is well chosen, because it lifts the personal story into its universal dimension without cheapening the specific. Long-term marital erosion is rarely the product of a single betrayal, it is the product of a sustained, mutual withdrawal from the kind of emotional vulnerability that intimacy requires. Both Daniel and Claire stopped reaching. What separates their respective positions is not the quality of their initial love but the choices they made when the reaching stopped. She sought elsewhere what she was not seeking within the marriage. He waited, managed, and quietly endured. Neither of these is the right answer. The right answer, the one available only in retrospect, only from the quiet apartment above the bookshop, only after everything is over, is the one Daniel is now, with deliberate imperfection, beginning to practice. Viewed in its entirety, Daniel and Claire's story is a study in what happens when two emotionally intelligent people allow the management of comfort to replace the practice of genuine intimacy. Neither character is a villain in the simple sense. Claire's choices were wrong, seriously, consequentially wrong, but they emerged from a real and unaddressed emotional reality, a woman who felt unseen by a man whose very competence had, over decades, become a kind of wall. Daniel's culpability is different in nature but not in consequence, a man so practiced in self-containment that his inner life became invisible to his partner, who then, rather than naming what she lacked, sought it in a direction that destroyed the foundation of what they had built. The central psychological mechanism of this story is what we might call the substitution of proximity for presence. Daniel and Claire shared a house, a table, a life, but they had, somewhere in the long middle years of the marriage, substituted the reliable fact of each other's presence for the more demanding and more renewable practice of genuine encounter. The once monthly closeness Claire rationed is the story's defining symbol. It tells us everything about how she had come to experience the marriage, as a maintenance obligation, something to be managed rather than inhabited. And the fact that Daniel noticed and named this rationing, quietly, without confronting it, tells us everything about the specific damage that long-trusted silence can do. The lesson is not a warning against infidelity, though infidelity is its dramatic axis. The lesson is about the profound human cost of substituting security for aliveness, of choosing the reliable comfort of a managed arrangement over the riskier, messier, more demanding truth of what two people actually need from each other. Daniel is learning, in the apartment above the bookshop, what the marriage could not teach him, that being known requires being knowable, and that the willingness to need is not weakness but the essential precondition of love.